Our next session is with Patricia Sullivan and Lawrence O'Donnell. We're really thrilled to have them here today. I'll introduce Lawrence just briefly, although I'm guessing he doesn't need much of an introduction. He is an anchor, an actor, a political commentator, and the host of The Last Word, an MSNBC opinion and news program that I'm sure many of you have seen airing on weeknights. Began his political career as an aide to U.S. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and from 1999 to 2006, he was associated with The West Wing, writing 16 episodes and garnering an Emmy for Outstanding Drama Series. He's been a contributor to Morning Joe and other shows, and we're so happy to have him here in conversation with Patricia. So please welcome them.
Thank you. So it's just sitting here right now, listening to that I realize I peaked years ago. This is the wreckage following that career around. And I'm sorry to say this is the closest you're going to get to Rachel Maddow, and which I know is why you're here. Patricia, I'm going to read to you about Patricia what her publisher wants you to know, okay? She's the author of Lift Every Voice, the NAACP, and the Making of the Civil Rights Movement, the first history of the formative decades of America's oldest civil rights organization, Days of Hope, Race, and Democracy in the New Deal Era, and Freedom Writer, Virginia Foster Durer, Letters from the Civil Rights Years. She is the William Arthur Ferry II Professor of History at the University of South Carolina. And she is the author of Justice Rising, Robert Kennedy's America in Black and White. This book, yes. And she is a longtime resident of this island where much of this was written. I think the best parts, actually.
Definitely.
I think you can tell, that passage is really moving. It must have been on a moody island night when she wrote that one. So, Patricia, you say to your literary agent and to Harvard University Press, I know there are 50,000 titles out there with the words Robert Kennedy in the book title, but we need another one. And it turns out we do, because this is a focus that we've never seen before.
Well, it wasn't my idea to write a book on Robert Kennedy. It was my literary agent's idea. Because as Lawrence mentioned, and thank you for doing this, by the way, and thanks to Sue Ellen and everyone here at the festival, my book on the NAACP, which was the book I completed before starting this book, and you say NAACP and people roll their eyes, but the NAACP from 1909 through the 50s was the formative engine for the civil rights struggle. And of course, the civil rights movement was not just in the 1960s. It began with the 14th Amendment being passed, citizenship rights, voting rights, and carried forward. And so in writing the NAACP book, which embraces legal brilliance, grassroots organizing, the strength of Black culture and institutions, interracial alliances, and this fundamental faith in democracy across several generations, how people sustained this effort. As Charles Houston would say, how they kept the light burning in the face of Jim Crow, segregation, and in the process of migration. From 1909 through the 1950s, African Americans are migrating from the South to cities in the North and the West, in the Midwest, transforming the nation's racial demography. And so by 1960, when this book really takes off, nearly half of African Americans live in northern and western cities, segregated, poor, substandard housing, everything James Baldwin writes about in The Fire Next Time, published in '62. So I wanted to take a fresh look at the 1960s, having come through that, and ask different kinds of questions. Not this civil rights, Black power, but this movement that has these deep roots and moves into a moment, because the sit-ins really ignite something and push us out of the Cold War political culture of the 50s and just open things up, bring youth in, and put this issue on the table. So I wrote this proposal, and I was very proud of it. And I showed it to Ellen. She read it, and she said, "This is very interesting. It's kind of academic." I said, "Well, that's what I am." And she said, "Look," she said, "you mentioned Robert Kennedy twice. Write a book about him." I said, "I don't want to write a book about him. I don't do that kind of history, from the top. No, I'm just grassroots." And So she said, well, think about it. She said two things. First thing, she says, I can sell it. Well, I have a job, and I don't live off my books. The second thing she said really grabbed me. She said, people will read it. The NASP was not a bestseller. It's a great book. I'm so proud of that book. So I thought about it, and I consulted a former student colleague now here, Lara Smith, and Blair Kelly, younger scholars, historians, African American and white, who work in this history. And this friend Blair Kelly said, we love him, Pat. We love him. So people knew things about him that I didn't know. And so I started reading, researching more, and sure enough, I mean, the way he moved through this decade and saw, responded to, and his brother too, I think that's just blew my mind. So I wrote the proposal, and curiously, I mean, there was a bidding war between Harvard and Yale. I mean, people saw, as you say, because it was a different take. And I think the fact that it was rooted in a story about African-American freedom struggle, civil rights, and just the racial explosion in the 1960s that really shapes our world today. So they were happy to get it by the time I came around, but Ellen Geiger, who's my agent, was wonderful advice.
Well, I'm so glad for her advice. And that point she makes about people will read it is so important, because there's so much in this book that has Robert Kennedy's picture and name on the cover that is not directly about Robert Kennedy, but is about very, very important events and very important people who we would not be reading about if he wasn't on the cover. And I'm thinking of, for example, this scene that I was aware of but have never read more detail about. Amazing moment where James Baldwin organizes a meeting for the Attorney General of the United States, Robert Kennedy, in 1963, in the spring of 1963, in the Kennedy apartment on Central Park South. And I have read dozens of accounts of this, none of them as in-depth as this, and I learned so much about it in this version. Talk about how that meeting happened, and then the extraordinary cast who's there, including the room filled with famous people. The least famous, most unknown person in the room takes over the room, shocks the Attorney General of the United States.
Yeah, no, that's the first thing I wrote as I started this book.
That's great.
Because that was one of the pieces in my proposal to her.
Yeah.
Was about this meeting. And as Lawrence has said, it's been written about, there was a play, but when you put it in historical context, May of 1963, Birmingham has already exploded. And, Birmingham set off protests and demonstrations across the country. The lid had come off. Mississippi, Greenwood, it was chaos. And the Kennedy brothers knew. Well, they saw this from their experience the previous 2.5 years as an opportunity to move. They knew they had to move because, people had it. But they saw it as an opportunity. The nation's attention was focused on this. So that's what's going on. And Dick Gregory said to Burke Marshall, who was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, they were working together in Birmingham. I mean, the Kennedy was trying to help. He said, why doesn't Bobby meet with James Baldwin? And they had met at the White House for a reception for Nobel Prize winners. And they had talked. It was in '62, I think. And they really were interested in each other. Kennedy he read the essay from the New Yorker that became the basis of Fire Next Time. So they said, we should talk again. And so—
Can I insert one Vineyard footnote right here on the very first meeting of James Baldwin and Robert Kennedy at the White House, because your source for that is
Rose Styron. And Rose—
I know that because it's right in here.
And thank you for mentioning that, because Rose and Bill, he went to the White House with Rose and Bill Styron. So yes, the network, and to talk with Rose, who was actually there, was pretty amazing. And again, that friendship, that's what pulled Baldwin into this moment. So when Gregory recommended it, I mean, Bobby Kennedy was ready to talk to anybody, because they just, and he understood what Baldwin, the depth of Baldwin's understanding, and he wanted to, sure, fine. So he flies to Washington to meet with Kennedy over breakfast, and his flight was late, and then Kennedy had to go somewhere else, and he was going to New York the next day for his brother's birthday celebration and other things. And so he said, oh, it wasn't just that, to meet with these department store owners, trying to persuade them to end segregation, because they knew even with the Civil Rights Act, it would take, if they could get it through, it would take a while. So he said, fine. And so Baldwin left and thought, you know, we need to get a lot of people together and really help him understand what's happening and what's at stake. So overnight, and he calls Lena Horne, says, I don't fly. He said, be here. Be here. Lorraine Hansberry, Kenneth Clark, Harry Belafonte, who was a good friend of Bobby's, Clarence Jones. I mean, as Lawrence said, a cast of stellar people. And not on the list, but who happened to be in New York being treated for a broken jaw, was Jerome Smith, who had been on the front lines of the civil rights, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, for 3 years. He was like, you know, a warrior coming from the battlefield to the meeting. And that's really the trigger, as you point out, that sets it out. So I'll speed up but it is the opening scene. And so they come together, and Burke and Kennedy coming back from this meeting where they made no headway with these department store owners. And he comes in there, and it's different expectations, you know, and it really captures the racial moment of it. Yeah. Kennedy was looking to them for advice, and I think wanted to reassure them that they were pushing for the Civil Rights Bill, and and Kenneth Clark wanted to, you know, read off statistics. Everybody had this moment with the Attorney General, and this young man is sitting there. So Kennedy starts off by explaining plans for the Civil Rights Act and just trying to, you know, and he said, being in this room with you makes me want to vomit. And imagine, he's the Attorney General, right? And he just turned away. And Lorraine Hansberry said, he is the only person in this room you should be listening to. And I think what struck me most, everyone in that room, no one understood what he had gone through. They had not. He was coming from the battlefield. And it went off and on for 3 hours. And he, you know, tried to respond, and he got a little defensive, and they just kept, it was a litany of all the things. And I think, you know, of course, you know, Kenneth Clark said it was the most violent verbal encounter that he had ever witnessed, but it was them just unloading on this guy who represented the federal government, top, and him just sitting there silent then for 3 hours, listening and taking it, you know. And in the course of it, I mean, the title of the preface is "The Best White America Has to Offer," because Lorraine Hansberry say, if you don't get it, and of course he's like, I can't, we're in trouble, because you and your brother are the best a white America has to offer.
And there was this stunning moment for Bobby Kennedy, which I think would have been stunning for most white Americans outside the room if they had gotten to see this. 1963, when James Baldwin in this meeting turns to Jerome Smith, who's the young civil rights worker who's been beaten nearly to death in the South, and says, as Patricia reports, asked by Baldwin if he would fight for his country, Smith answered, never. Kennedy, visibly shaken, said, how can you say that? And that was a truly stunning moment for Bobby Kennedy. There had never been a real anti-war protest in America. That was years away in 1963. And here was someone saying something that Bobby Kennedy just couldn't process.
Imagine an American citizen. And what Kenneth Clark said, we were shocked that he was shocked.
Shocked that he was shocked, yes. And then there's this part that I did not know that is so important. And this is the way the great researchers and writers complete a scene, because that scene has always ended in any version I've ever read. It's ended in that room, which is not the way life works. Because what Patricia tells us is, several months later, at a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, Senator Robert Kennedy says, How long can we say to a Negro in Jackson, when war comes, you will be an American citizen, but in the meantime, you're a citizen of Mississippi, and we can't help you?
No, that's perfect. No, that's
You're watching the learning curve of, in this scene, a 37-year-old man who is learning along with white America, and he is actually I'm a teenager, I'm a little kid at the time, but my experience, my sense of this is he's learning faster than most 37-year-old white Americans at that time.
No, definitely. I mean, it's really was remarkable to kind of go through with him and observe that process.
There's another remarkable moment that shows this learning curve, and now we're up to age 40. And by the way, when I was thinking about this discussion, I was thinking, should we save to the end that he died at 42, and everything you just heard about was somebody who was 35 years old or 36 or 37 or 30, because it's truly stunning, the age of this person as he's going through these things, having grown up in a world that was a world, thoughts existed in cement. He didn't grow up in an experimental world or an intellectually experimental world. That wasn't what was happening. And he's thrown into the 1960s, and suddenly everything's an experiment. Music becomes an experiment. Poetry is an experiment. Allen Ginsberg is wandering around the presidential campaigns, and clothes become an experiment before the decade is over. And he's living through all of that. He goes to South Africa in 1966. And again, this is, by the way, much of this book has stuff that I've never read any version of. But this is something I've read some versions of. I did not know that him getting even a visa to go to South Africa involved some challenge. But the 44 or so journalists who wanted to go to South Africa, Americans to go to South Africa with him to cover the senator's trip to South Africa, were all denied visas. They were not allowed to go. That's the country he went into in 1966 to deliver a speech.
No, yes. I mean, and they let him go because, I mean, King was also invited by this student group, anti-apartheid student group. His visa was denied. But they let Kennedy go because they thought, he may be president someday. Not a good idea to leave him out, but to let him, to sort of silence him, really. But reports got out about his...
And the account in here, which is the most detailed I've read, really reads like the Beatles have just landed at JFK to do the Ed Sullivan Show. I mean, it's just, there's like there's thousands of people at the airport everywhere when this man arrives.
No, yes, I mean, Margaret Marshall, who was his student advisor, who is a great former Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, she recounts it, and she said it was mixed race. I mean, just everybody got out there, and she said it was not easy to get to the airport, back then. It was far out in Cape Town. And he goes to the colored side of the place when he comes in. And it's just so spontaneous. And it was like, he was the only person from the outside, someone coming in who's going to be questioning the system, right? So, and then it carries on from there. I mean, the crowds that turn out, Africana as well as Black African and colored. I mean, it's...
And he delivered a written speech that he considered very, very carefully. And there's this quote that is in the beginning of the speech that appears in the book in this passage. It says, he opened by describing a country that had been, quote, settled by the Dutch in the mid-17th century, then taken over by the British, and at last independent, a land in which the native inhabitants were at first subdued, but relations with whom remain a problem to this day, a land which was once an importer of slaves and now must struggle to wipe out the last trace of that former bondage. I refer, of course, to the United States of America. And the reason I want to begin with the Baldwin meeting is that guy in 1963 didn't see the world this way.
No.
And this is 1966.
3 years later. 3 years later. No, that's a great measure of his rapid growth. And yeah, what you said about this sort of experiential time and all, and him just going. You know, Marion Wright Edelman said about Bobby, he went, he saw, he listened, he grew. A former student called him a radical listener, but he's learning, he's soaking it up. You know, he has questions, and I think that's, you know, coming in 61 as Attorney General. Yes, and then the constant interactions, and that interaction with the Baldwin crowd. I mean, just going there and sitting there and listening, and then reflecting, and as you point out, understanding Jerome Smith and agreeing with him, basically.
And it was something that no other senator would have done then for two reasons. No other senator would have been invited, number one.
Right.
And then, it's hard for me to imagine who else would have accepted such an invitation. And then once there on foreign soil, as they love to say in Washington, D.C., actually saying something that sounds critical of the United States of America.
No, astounding. I mean, you know, I spoke with Margaret and a filmmaker who, Larry Shore, who's made a great film of Robert Kennedy's visit to South Africa. He was 12 when Bobby came. He's white. And he just marveled. He went to Soweto. He said no white people went to Soweto, one of the largest townships, or they went in the middle of the night, some ANC person. He went and stood on cars and back, chairs, and just engaged with people. He just went all through. And as he was leaving, I mean, I'm trying to think of the Africana chief he went to see, the Thule.
Oh, yeah. I think that's it.
But he just went, and he would speak with anyone. That's what Margaret said. He would talk to anyone. He would go straight to the people. He had no filters. He said it straight. And by the time he left, and I read many accounts from people there in newspapers, in the Soweto paper, about the experience of him being there. It was like a window had opened. And she said, he didn't talk about apartheid so much as he talked about justice, freedom, and dignity. She said words we had not heard for a long time. And the power of that. And there's something in the book, not in the book, that I learned. He can't put everything in a book. When he was traveling out to California for his last, for the primary, and where things ended pretty badly, but there was a South African reporter who, based in Canada, who tried to interview him, and he said his aides really thought, you're a Canadian reporter. But he got to him, and he said the first thing Robert Kennedy asked him and he named the students he had met 2 years earlier. And this guy said, they're all in prison. And he said, listen to me, if I'm elected president, apartheid is at the top. So he remembered, and there's that piece too, the South African piece.
Yeah. On November 22nd, 1963, I was in St. Brendan's Elementary School in Dorchester, about 80 miles north of here, when we got the word that the president from Boston had been assassinated, and in an instant, the word Kennedy morphed from being vigor and glamour and Camelot and excitement into simply tragedy. The word Kennedy, from that point forward, always carried the word tragedy in it. Robert Kennedy was the face of tragedy in the aftermath of his brother's assassination, both at his brother's funeral and then on into his career and into his presidential campaign. This book ends with the kind of stunning reverberation of Kennedy as tragedy again with Robert Kennedy's assassination. You lived through this. As a writer, you now have to describe these things that you lived through. Were the feelings of the moment in 1968 and of that other moment in 1963, were they in your mind, your hand, as you were writing these words?
They were. I mean, I was in the 8th grade when President Kennedy was killed, and I was getting ready to graduate from high school. And as you say, it was our 9/11, right? I mean, it just everything sort of ended. I mean, especially with President Kennedy, and then Robert Kennedy. But in writing the book and learning what I learned as I researched and wrote the book, I mean, the magnitude of the loss was, I mean, when I was finishing the book, I ended with his speech in California where he said, and on to Chicago and let's win there. And I started the epilogue with Ted Kennedy's eulogy. And my editor said, no, you've got to tell the reader. Well, I said, they know, because this is about his life, you know. And so we worked that out with the help of another former student, how to do that. But it was really hard to do it. And again, I just think that his life is what is, you know, so powerful and so connected up with the promise of the 60s, with the struggles of the 60s. But at this stage, it was so powerful, and I understood so much more now from, you know, when I was younger. But to have been there and that be part of your memory, and then to go back many years later, almost 50 years later, more than that.
We all cried on those assassination days in '63 and then again in '68, the two assassination days, Martin Luther King, followed 6 weeks later by Bobby Kennedy. Did you cry when you wrote these passages?
Mm-hmm. I did, and it was deep sadness for him because I spent, you know, 9 years working on this book, and I got to know, I mean, he's not perfect, but it's just that growth and that just remarkable human being who was engaged with his times, and particularly with the struggle that we continue to struggle with today. And so the loss of, you know, if he had not, who knows, but the point is our country would have bent in another direction. And just that loss, I mean, just the loss of the, you know, because his campaign, everyone who was connected and part of and creating this new kind of politics. You know, there's a quote that I want to mention in relationship to this. You know, Robert Kennedy presided with Abraham Ribicoff over these hearings in the summer and fall of 1966, which predated the Kerner Commission report by more than a year. Everything is there. You know, it's volumes of this. And in the hearing, he had Ralph Ellison, they had Civil Rights Act, they had mayors, everyone who should be concerned and part of this issue that is huge and deep in American history. And Ralph Ellison said, and I wrote it down because I thought about this and thinking about '68, he said to Kennedy, "We are living in a time of chaos within the total political structure." This is '66. After Watts, after a summer of more in Des Moines and Omaha and places like that of urban uprisings, we do not have the political structures that can contain the energies set loose by the Civil Rights Act. And I think about that because what he was doing was trying to create, in concert with all the people who gravitated around his campaign, a political frame for moving forward. And that sort of, and again, people carried on, but he had that capacity because of who he was and these 8 years in this journey to do that. And I think that, you know, Ellison's, and we're still struggling to find the political structures to contain the energies. And I think by that he meant, you know, people had it. That's what you got in that meeting in New York. We can't wait. Oh, it's not good enough. You've got to wait till the Congress is ready. Or no, no, we're not going to wait. And they understood that. So all of that, and you just need it. And the Kennedy brothers and President Kennedy, I must say, we're coming to the end of our time, but he got it. I mean, Thurgood Marshall went to see him in April of 19. The Kennedys got it. And they were prepared to move within the structure of government in concert with this pressure and opportunity created by the Civil Rights Movement. But I lost my train of thought there. But it's, so there's just this, you know, the response. Right, I mean, the Civil Rights Act, then you have Harlem after a policeman shoots a 15-year-old high school student. I mean, it's just raging. It's on fire, and there's a book about that. But we had people during this period, including Dr. King and many others, who were really working and trying to create the way that we could begin to face our past. And here's a great Kennedy quote there. He said, "We can either face our difficulties." This is in 1966 to a group at Berkeley. "We can either face our difficulties and strive to overcome them, or turn away, bringing repression, increasing human pain, and civil strife." And that's where we are, right? and he saw it. And I think, I mean, the good news is that people can see and work towards and be engaged in a way. And it's your theme about growth is really important as a public servant, as a public figure, and someone who's responsive to his world and to the deep history, as he called it, a racial crisis, 100 years since Reconstruction in the making.
At his funeral, at Bobby Kennedy's funeral, Teddy Kennedy delivered a eulogy that, to my ear, is the single best public eulogy I've ever heard, and contains a phrase that I remember to this day. I remember from the moment I saw it on the television and never had to write it down, and it's that a good and decent man. And it appears here with the full phrases that followed it. A good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, and saw war and tried to stop it. Is that your view of Bobby Kennedy?
Yeah, that's well said, simple and true. You know, and you know, and he was one person, right? But what he did in his time, I agree with you about the eulogy. It really captures. Don't inflate.
Yeah.
This is who he was.
Yeah.
And we can have his words, we have his life, we have those lessons to carry forward.
Our politics and our culture has changed dramatically since the 1960s, and it's hard to conceive of a kind of privileged family like this having the kind of success that they did electorally. Franklin Roosevelt, very similar, a guy who never had to work a day in his life, and his entire life was financed by his mother every single day of his life, right? And yet they connected FDR, JFK, RFK in these ways that are kind of hard to imagine happening now. And I'm thinking about just the general level of media outrage that would meet the idea that the president has decided that his little brother, who is 35 years old, will be the Attorney General of the United States, even though he has never tried a case in a courtroom anywhere in America. That's who we're talking about in this, and who we are praising, I think both of us, in so many ways for the job that person did as Attorney General. And there seems to be a lesson in that this notion that there's this very specific list of who and what you must be in order to do this work, in order to have these jobs, is something that we might want to think about. We might want to be more expansive about our ideas in that way.
Totally. Well, that's true, and I know our time is up, but that choice of Robert Kennedy, President Kennedy knew civil rights was going to be front and center. He said, I need someone I can trust, I need someone who can tell me the truth, I need someone to make the hard choices. And when he got the criticism from the Times and leading scholars, and on grounds that made sense, he said, forget it. Trying a case, that's not what we need. We need to build a great Justice Department and have someone who can get the best people and who's going to do the work. And he described exactly what his brother did. And that Justice Department was just extraordinary. I mean, it was, but you're right. I mean,
Yeah.
He didn't listen to the blowback.
No. At least Teddy Kennedy had been an assistant DA in Boston for a few months before he became a senator. We are ready for questions from the audience. There are 2 microphones that must have something to do with the question process, right? Is the idea that you walk up to the microphone? Yeah. If you want to approach a microphone and ask a question, please do. How much does this book surprise you? The person who started doing the book, the person who you were at the first day of this project.
It was like writing a novel. I didn't know what was going to happen, and I knew I was onto something, but no, what I found, and as you point about him and about this, looking at the 60s through these angles and really putting the African American struggle at the center, north, south, east, west. It was, but no, about him, it really was he surprised me completely.
We have a question over here.
I'm in the middle of reading the biography of Lady Bird Johnson, and I haven't read your book yet. We're looking forward to it. I was just wondering if you have any perspective on her influence on him, or the relationship with the Johnsons together. Big question.
No, it's a great question. I won't go on and on, but that was one of the things I really learned so much about. You know, the press and historians have already gotten this personality thing, and they didn't like each other. That's not a big surprise. But their approach to this central issue in our history was so different. And on the war and on what would happen after. I mean, the period after '64 with the uprisings and the escalation of the war in Vietnam. I mean, Kennedy described this era, Bobby Kennedy, as the greatest crisis since the Civil War, because you needed more poverty programs, and we're getting less. It's going into the war. So they didn't like it, but they had very different approaches. And from what I concluded, Robert Kennedy did not spend his time worrying about. He worried that everything he said challenging Johnson would be filtered through personality. And that was one of the hesitancies of running, that the issues would become, well, he doesn't like Lyndon, he thinks he should be president. But it was very basic on race, on what to do about the cities, on the war, on poverty, all of those things. So I think those of you who, we all have opinions about LBJ and RFK, but that was one of the really eye-opening, what I found. So they didn't, they tried to work together. Early on, Robert Kennedy was all for the war on poverty as it started out, but things, went off track for all kinds of reasons, but really political, social reasons, not personality reasons.
The civil rights movement at that time, as you said, when the civil rights legislation passed, it was going to, that brilliant prediction that it was going to unleash energies that can't be managed. It turns out we are now witnessing very clearly the energies against the civil rights action, civil rights laws that were released then, seems to me remained relatively muted over time, but have now mushroomed and exploded in the 21st century. The whole Trumpist energy that has a tremendous amount of anti-civil rights energy in it.
Well, it's been a struggle all along to sustain the Voting Rights Act, and then the 2013 court decision. But no, things have really exploded now. But I think if you look back, it's a constant push, and again, not expanding. I mean, not really dealing with what was happening, the consequence of the migration and this creation of these segregated, impoverished communities and cities. We turned away, and that's when the incarceration, law and order, militarization of policing, and the spike in incarceration starts in the late '60s. But what you're describing, even more so, very overt. They had other reasons for it then, that crime, war on crime, but now it's taken a turn where it's just much more overt and unashamed. Yeah. Really.
We have a question over here.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about RFK's relationship to the labor movement. I think toward the end of the '60s, the civil rights movement, in addition to being linked to struggles against poverty, I think was growing closer to labor struggles. RFK had a sort of interesting history with respect to that, and so I'm wondering if you could talk about.
He had interesting. I mean, I think the Rackets Committee again. My assumptions were challenged by my research on that. That's when he developed a very close relationship with Walter Reuther, the head of the UAW. There's labor and there's labor. There's big labor, and then of course as a senator, Cesar Chavez and the farm workers. He had support from union and the issues of work, poverty, trying to get a minimum wage for migrant workers. And when he ran in California, it's a great question. I don't go deep into that, but when he was working in one of his biggest organizers, Paul Schrad, who was head of the UAW for the Western region. But big labor supported the war in Vietnam. They were tied hook, line, and sinker to that. So I think when we say labor, we have an idea that it's this one thing. And I think workers and labor unions I think with progressive unions and unions that were on civil rights issues, migrant workers, that sort of thing, he was very responsive and saw that part of this coalition he was trying to build on in the campaign in '68.
And Cesar Chavez, founder of the United Farm Workers, was on the stage with him in Los Angeles the night he was assassinated. We have a question over here.
Yes, thank you for a great conversation. Bobby Kennedy obviously was a tremendous person and a leader that the country looks back on. For both of you, we're in the same sort of situation where we could use leadership to take this divided country in a different situation. Suggestions on people that you would look to, whether they're in Washington or civic leaders, that we should pay attention to and perhaps follow and look for new leadership.
His leadership was created by civil rights struggles, black freedom struggle, migrant. I think this interactive. So a leader. He came out of what was created by these struggles, particularly around civil rights and race. But democracy. I mean, so I guess we need to try. And I also think the media, everything is so short-circuited. He had room to grow. He didn't say something and didn't turn up on the phone right away.
Right.
He can make a mistake. He didn't be. There was. I mean, historians do gotcha. I found that with the Kennedy civil rights. Well, what about this? But well, I've done the work. They're more complicated. But now, in this media moment, I think about that. But certainly that kind of leadership. I mean, what you describe as this person living in his time, and living in a way that's engaged and using. He gave a commencement address at Manhattan College in 1962, and he said to the students, your parents and your teachers didn't sacrifice for you just so you could go out and make more than some other guy, just to go make money. And then in '64, he loved to talk to college audiences, and he really emphasized their responsibility, their privilege. I mean, not now you're privileged, that's a bad thing. No, you've got an opportunity because you've had an education, and now you understand these things, but it doesn't mean you just read some magazine. You've got to live it. And I think those of us who work with students or just that's the leadership will grow from that. That's what I would say.
We have another one.
I have a similar question, but sort of, I think, framed a bit differently. And I'll sort of get to it quickly. I'm a black guy, and being a black man, one of the things that I always do is I canvass a room when I walk into it to see if there are any, and if so, how many people in the room look like me. Mm-hmm. More and more in the circles that I am in, I am sort of one. I am alone or I am one of a few. And that is certainly the case here. So the question I have is not necessarily what folks at high levels can do, but what folks at this level can do to try to sort of push things along, to be more cognizant of the environments that they are in, and ask on an ongoing basis if the room is pretty monolithic in its population, why is that, and how we as individuals can change that. Because change doesn't appear, it occurs down on the ground.
No, I agree. I mean, I think in terms of when we look and we see, but how, this, the program for the author series is very diverse, and people who choose to come. The fact is, on Martha's Vineyard, there are so many other things to do, but your point is so well taken, because as a teacher, as someone, you want to have an inclusive environment and be sure that you're doing everything to make sure that happens. So I guess I would ask you, what do you think could be done, like for this event today, which is a Saturday?
Students.
Pardon?
Free tickets to students, free books to students. We all have money.
Okay, no, but that's a different thing. We should have students here. No, we should have students here of all, but that's another kind of, because it's not just, that's a, I agree, free books, I'm always for that. And then make them read it. I can't assign a whole book in my class. The attention span is like that.
They came here and saw these speakers.
Yeah.
They would
Well, that's another good point. What do we do to get more young people and to be more diverse? And you know, I'm on the advisory board of the book festival, so, and, you know, we will certainly address that. But I think
Yeah.
it's kind of,
We have a question right
yeah.
But let's not forget the fact that after I leave here, I'm going to the 9-day African American Film Festival that's running from 11 o'clock in the morning till midnight at the high school in the Performing Arts Center for its 19th consecutive year, with a list of documentaries that's as long as my two arms out here. So we just need to break our silos down and cross the color lines and get going here.
Well, we have books by also terrific writers
Absolutely.
of all backgrounds. So let's work on that, okay? And great pitch for the African American Film Festival. I strongly recommend. It's terrific. It's terrific.
One of the things that this book documents and takes us through is the very beginnings of this kind of public discussion in the 1960s. These questions all began in the 1960s during the period of this book.
No, that's right. That's right. It's,
And there's one more question right
I
here.
don't know if you were looking for suggestions of how to get people together, but often dinners, small dinners, one of the things that could be a follow-up to this was people signing up to have small dinners at their house with diverse groups. Because one of the things that happens when you're out like this, you tend to, of course, your friends often look like you do, but having a intentional effort to have people of different ethnic groups, different socioeconomic groups get together and have a meal and talk.
well, and I think all of us can do that individually, I mean, to be part of this. So I don't think it has to be organized by the book festival, but good idea. We should all work towards that. Can we have one more?
There's one more.
She's gonna ask a quick one.
Is there time?
Yeah.
So civil rights historians have been largely critical of the Kennedys in terms of the way that they respond to the freedom rides and kind of the work they do. Can you talk a little bit about how what you discovered through researching this book kind of shifts that understanding?
Well, that historians have made claims not based on research, you know? I mean, they listened to activists who were unhappy with the Kennedys, rightly so. They wanted more done. But Gloria Richardson, who just passed away, and Bob Moses, who was a dear friend of mine, they were very positive about the Kennedys. Bob worked closely with John Doerr and Bob Burke Marshall. So I think it's a lack of imagination. It's assumptions, because what you see when you look, and Larry, you work on Prince Edward County. There's a school in Virginia that was closed in 1959. 1,700 black children were without school.
All the public schools were closed.
Yeah, all the public schools. And they set up private schools for white children, and they used tax money to subsidize them. And of course, throws it into court, the NAACP, you have to go sue. And this irked the Kennedys from the minute they got into office. They were on it. Robert Kennedy tried to intervene in a lawsuit. It got thrown out because they could sue the state. The NAACP couldn't sue the state. They worked with the NAACP, but the amazing thing, in the winter, February of '63, the president said to Burke Marshall, do whatever you can that's remotely legal and possible to help those children. And in September of '63, before President Kennedy, Bobby got on it. He sent Bill Vanden Heuvel down, as you know, and they created a free public school for those students that opened on September 16th, the day after the church bombing in Birmingham. And they had school for a year before the Supreme Court threw out the closing of the schools and made them open it up. So,
Patricia Sullivan, thank you very much for writing this book. I learned so much. You will learn a lot. Thank you very much for doing this today. Thank you all. Thank you.